Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the Abuse Prevention panel focusing on policy implementation as part of the Move United Leadership Conference. My name is Carolyn Stott, and I'm a program manager with Move United, formerly Disabled Sports USA. We would like to thank the Bob Woodruff Foundation for their long-standing commitment and support for allowing us to bring you this virtual opportunity. For those who missed any previous sessions, recordings and sessions resources can be found on the conference webpage. This is the same webpage you used to RSVP for this session. Before turning the show over to our speakers today, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. All attendees will be on mute to minimize distractions. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to submit questions rather than through the chat. Feel free to use the chat function to introduce yourselves, and make sure to send your chat messages to all panelists and attendees to introduce yourself to the whole group. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Semke with Move United, and we'll get started.
Awesome, thank you, Carolyn. And just to real quick, before we dive in, I want to take a moment to allow each of our panelists today to introduce ourselves. As Carolyn mentioned, my name is Ryan Semke. I'm the insurance program manager here at the new Move United. Many of you have had phone calls with me, emails with me, attended other webinar sessions on sport protection policy and athlete safety. So you might be sick of hearing from me. So that's why I brought in some friends today to help mix up some of the content a little bit. But thank you again for everyone's commitment to providing a safe sport and recreation environment for our minor athletes and participants. So yeah, I'll allow everyone to introduce themselves. Hannah?
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you for having me. So my name is Hannah Hinton. I'm the Director of Audit and Compliance at the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. So I oversee our audit program of all 50 NGBs, as well as the USOPC. We also have a compliance development team, which supports NGBs through a variety of resources, best practices, materials, ensuring that they are implementing all of the policies that the center puts forth.
Awesome, thanks. And Katie?
Hi, everyone. It's great to meet you. My name is Katie Hanna. I'm the Chief Programs Officer at the U.S. Center for Safe Sport. So I work really closely with Hannah, who runs the audit and compliance team. What I do at the center is work with an awesome team of folks that are developing training resources, the online training we'll talk about a little bit later today, and the policies that we have set forth around the minor athlete abuse prevention policies. So I love seeing how everybody's from all across the country in the chat box. So it's really great to meet you virtually today.
Awesome. And last but not least, Maggie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie Green. I'm the Senior Investigator at the USOPC in the Office of Athlete Safety. My primary responsibilities revolve around response and resolution of misconduct. Our office in general is responsible for training and education related to some of our participants, as well as policy implementation and the response and resolution side. So happy to be here.
Awesome. Thank you all very much again for being here. And before we get really started and dive in, I wanted to just real quick go over what the Move United Sport Protection Policy is, some of the key points about it, and kind of explain some of the differences and how this panel may look and how it may differ this afternoon. Obviously, we instituted this requirement for our chapters beginning end of last year, and we're starting implementation this year. A lot of folks previously who are not members of, or previously members of Paralympic sport clubs or national governing bodies had been thinking about, and are we not compliant with Safe Sport? Do we need to be? What policies should we have in place? So there was a bit of a gray area there. So we took a step forward in developing our sport protection policy. For those of you who are members of Safe Sport, or NGBs, I should say, governed by Safe Sport, you may know that it's extremely similar. There are a lot of similarities with it, but again, not everyone within our network was technically associated with that. So we wanted to bring up something that was for our network to bring everyone up to the same standard. So real quick, like I said, I just want to touch some of the key components of the sport protection policy, and hopefully we can all see my screen here. Thumbs up, we can see my screen. Awesome. Real quick, there's 6 key points of the sport protection policy that I'm going to touch on real quick. The training and education aspect of it. This is where a lot of folks see safe sport and think safe sport. It's the actual training itself on abuse and misconduct awareness for all your covered individuals. This training needs to occur on an annual basis. Safe Sport, as I mentioned, is our recommended vendor and provider of this training. While other services can be utilized, they are our preferred vendor and recommended vendor. Obviously, we have a great partnership with them, as 2 of them are able to join us on the panel this afternoon. Moving forward, background screening, another key aspect that a lot of folks think of when they think of this topic. That's not just the background check itself, the criminal background check, but it's also registration and application process for volunteer roles within your organization and interviews for volunteers where appropriate, and where additional screening may be needed for those volunteers based upon their roles. The National Center for Safety Initiatives, NCSI, is our recommended vendor for that service. And the requirement is that these background checks are completed every 12 months, or rechecked every 12 months, I should say. Defining prohibited conduct. This is really kind of where it shapes what is and isn't acceptable and allowed from behaviors aspect as well as interactions. So policies that address all forms of abuse and misconduct, not just physical and sexual abuse, but misconduct including bullying, hazing, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and defining what those are, examples of, and what other forms of appropriate behavior might be in place of those. Athlete abuse prevention policies. These are the implementation aspects of the policy itself and what it looks like when you're interacting with your participants on a daily basis and your athletes on a daily basis. So supervision of athletes and participants, essentially, how are there athletes alone with a adult, or are there multiple adults present when that's going on? Physical contact, if you do need to come in contact physically with your athletes, what is that? What does that look like? What is acceptable? So you're not doing it in an inappropriate manner that would be seen as a violation. Electronic and social media communications. So these policies would address how you interact with your athletes in the digital world we live in today. Locker rooms and changing areas, and other areas where there may be donning on or off of clothes or equipment. And then travel, both local, distance, overnight, what those different policies look like. And then additionally, obviously, it's response to violations. If there is a violation of a coach or someone who's doing something that is not appropriate or is a policy violation, but isn't seen as a criminal act, how that's reported, but also how to report those acts that are of abuse or severe misconduct that need to be reported and documented with local law enforcement, as well as internally. What are the disciplinary rules and procedures? And again, I know I'm kind of plowing through this. All of this information can be found at moveunitedsport.org or sportprotection.org as well. So there's more resources if sounds very new to you. I don't want to dwell too much on the nuts and bolts of what the policy is. If you have further questions, I'm happy to discuss on a separate time there. And then the last aspect of the policy is your policy monitoring strategy. What are you doing to check to make sure these policies are being followed? And then what is your monitoring and checking and process to make sure your policies are still relevant and up to date? Again, that's a super 50,000 foot overview of what the sport protection policy is, what aspects that you should be implementing within your program. If you have questions, my contact information is on the screen. Please feel free to reach out to me. But all of our sport protection information can be found at sportprotection.org. So feel free to check that out. Again, I know that was super quick, so I apologize, but I wanted to now speak to, and hopefully we've got some questions about, okay, we've got our policy developed. We know what we need to have in place. How do we actually do it, right? While we're all in a programmatic hold because of the current health pandemic going on, we were talking about returning to play. That was the session that just happened previously. when we return to play, how do we implement some of those abuse prevention policies? How do we implement the training and education with our volunteers? What are some best practices? What are some challenges we may have? So that's really why we're kind of gathered here today.
Great, thanks, Ryan. So I really appreciate you going over those really quickly. As Ryan mentioned, we really want this to be an interactive panel, so please put your questions into the Q&A section of the chat here, of the Q&A function. I have a few questions I'm going to start with, but we definitely want to be able to answer the questions that you guys have on your mind. So I'm going to start with a question for Hannah. You know, Ryan went over some of our policy requirements, but can you talk a little bit about any tips or best practices for implementation from your experience with Safe Sport?
Sure, yeah, thank you. So I think, especially given the climate and that we have a little bit of downtime, I think one of the most important things that my team has seen is to slow down and really make sure that you're educating your staff and your leadership on these policies. So what we've seen is when there's buy-in from the top, there's a trickle-down effect. So I would say really take this time and make sure that whether it's a national team coach, people running events, really understand these policies and are well versed on them, and that will have a huge impact at the buy-in for your organization as a whole. The second thing is communication. Communication. So finding various ways for your particular membership, whether that's putting out YouTube videos, whether that's utilizing social media, whether that's simple email blasts, whether that's newsletters. I think that's one of the biggest gaps that we've seen, is not using enough different avenues to make sure that your members understand the policies. Particularly, this is very new. So I think those are two pieces work hand in hand. First, the education, and then the communication piece. And also doing this in small tidbits and breaking it up, because the policy can be a lot. So breaking this down, maybe you have a 5-minute YouTube video that's just covering your transportation policy, a 5-minute video that's covering travel or locker rooms, something like that. I think can make it more digestible to folks. The second thing, kind of getting into the weeds a little bit in some of the policies. The first suggestion that we found that's been helpful is in the locker rooms is, when you're having that volunteer monitor the locker rooms, is making sure that person is educated. So if maybe before an event you have a 20-minute, 30-minute sort of overview of what the policies and what the expectations are for that specific volunteer or whoever is going to be in that role, I think is helpful, as opposed to just pulling someone in and, hey, can you do this? So I think carving out time to have sort of an intro orientation session has been helpful for a lot of our the NGBs that we oversee. Additionally, on the social media piece, that's another one that's been hard for NGBs to manage, but the ones who have been most successful have moved to utilizing these team apps so that they can control what's being said, who's seeing what. They've also moved to some NGBs putting bans on social media connections between some of the covered individuals, applicable adults, and minor athletes. So those are connections on Facebook, Twitter, things like that. And they've just put a ban on that because it's too easy to utilize those for private messaging. So they've moved away from that completely into the various team apps that are out there. And so finding one that would work for your specific organization. So those are just a couple sort of high-level general tips that we've found that have been very helpful for the NGBs that we oversee.
Great. And someone had a question kind of related to some of that you were talking about. Kat wants to know specifically when it comes to blind athletes and one-on-one interactions or locker room protocols, what have you found to be the best prevention policies?
Can you explain that a little bit more? So in terms of the locker rooms?
So I think they're talking about if you would have a blind athlete, obviously they might need a guide or someone with them. Is there any sort of policies related to locker rooms that you would want to implement to ensure that, that people are being safe?
Yeah, Katie can speak a little bit, but I know that we talked about some of those individuals having personal care assistants and making sure that they're supporting that individual, as well as making sure that they've taken the training, they understand the policy as well, especially if they're going to be engaging with other minor athletes. If not, carving out, potentially separate times if needed, depending on what this individual, and this goes not just for locker rooms, but also if that individual is traveling, hotels, transportation as well, and making sure that that individual is aware of the policies is just as important as the volunteers that I spoke about.
Yeah, and this is Katie. I'll add to that too, Kat. Really important question. Glad you raised that. One of the things that we're in the process of releasing later this summer is a revised, updated minor athlete abuse prevention policies. It's going to have some additional guidance and really looking at those exceptions and what that looks like, as well as an implementation guide or manual that goes along with that. So addressing some additional guidance that we'd be happy to distribute to Move United, just as people are putting some of those policies in place as well.
Great. The next question I'm going to direct at Ryan. It's a little bit Move United specific. Ryan, they're asking, Sarah wants to know, we have paid staff, but also a crew of thousands of volunteers. While ideally everyone would have gone through Safe Sport, is it acceptable to not have volunteers Safe Sport certified since they don't have power over athletes or participants and are at the direction of paid staff who have done the Safe Sport training?
That is a really good question, very common one, and one that's very prevalent in our industry. With the way the covered individual definition is kind of framed out, and I won't spend too much time on that. I'm happy to connect further if you still have more questions. Essentially is we're looking at, paid staff, board of directors, individuals who are in positions of authority over minor athletes, or who may be perceived to be in a position of power, or to represent the organization. So your volunteer who shows up 2-3 times a year, helps out with registration, supports a lesson, let's say it's a ski lesson as the assistant, or volunteers and is part of a group lesson on a cycling program. Those aren't the individuals. Ideally, like you said, it'd be great to have them all certified and background checked, but those aren't those who are in the highest areas of risk or concern. We're looking at the coaches who are showing up on a weekly basis and interacting with youth athletes. We're looking at your go-to youth ski instructor who will do 50+ ski lessons with minor athletes where parents aren't present, and those who are seen as the face of the organization, whether it be a trainer, a lead volunteer, a volunteer coordinator. So trying to identify where, if there is a separation in your volunteer population between those who only ever support as an assistant or never alone. Obviously, down the road, we want everyone to be educated, and there should be education outside of Safe Sport. That should be as part of your volunteer training onboarding that addresses these policies. That may not be as in-depth as a Safe Sport training or darkness to light training, but that still educate on the policies. That is part of the training requirement for all volunteers. So I don't want to go on too much longer. Hopefully that addresses it, but if you still have questions on it, I'm happy to clarify. And I apologize, my dog has a open wound, so I'm checking to make sure he's not licking when my eyes come off camera, so I apologize. The joys of working from home, right?
Thanks, Ryan. I'm going to switch topics a little bit to background checks. And Maggie, I think maybe you can answer a couple of these questions that we have. Obviously monitoring and implementing background checks can be a little bit time consuming and costly, especially for a lot of our smaller member organizations. Can you first talk a little bit about why it's still so important to make sure that we're doing those? And then secondly, some practices for implementing and any tips for helping reduce maybe some of those costs or some of that time.
Sure. So background checks are very important. I mean, obviously, it's important to know who you are giving access to your athletes, who this person is that you're giving access to your athletes. And so a lot of times in background checks, you can have visibility into prior sexual crime related convictions or violent crimes that you would have no way of knowing otherwise. So they are very important in screening your volunteers, your staff. I do understand that they are they can be time consuming to track all of these requirements. NCSI does have automation, so they do have the ability to automate to things such as your membership database. We at the USOPC are kind of a different organization in that we have a lot of participants, and we have participants at varying times. So you may not be our participant year round, but if you go to a games such as the Olympics, then you're our participant for a short amount of time. And so we have utilized their automation for our games registration that automatically populates the date, which has been very helpful. We don't utilize it right now because we are working on getting a membership database. So a lot of our individuals at our organization that are responsible for tracking backgrounds are doing what a lot of people do, which is using spreadsheets and doing quarterly reports and sending out emails. But if you are able to get a membership database, you can use reminders. They can auto send reminders to individuals, and you can pick the number of days out to give that reminder, such as 30 or 60 days that you need to complete this background check. They can also set up reminders for the individual who's in charge of it. So I know that the new platform for NCSI has even more automation capabilities, and anyone joining now would be on that platform. We are not on that one yet. We were going to wait until after Tokyo. And so now that's in the process of getting that, getting us on that platform. But I do completely understand. I mean, there are a lot of our NGBs tie everything to membership. So if you have to apply for membership on a yearly basis, then you automatically have to do the background check, you have to do the safe sport training, and they try to tie that all together for dates so that they're monitoring it at one certain time. We found that useful as well. I know we're not speaking to this right now, but for our training requirements, we've gone to a 2-week window once a year where all of our participants are informed that they need to take the training so that we're monitoring it during a select amount of time. As far as how you fund it, I know a lot of NGBs do membership fees associated with licensing and such to help offset the cost of the training and education and background checks. I did see that it looks like, Ryan, correct me if I'm wrong, but Move United has the parent application for NCSI, is that right? Which allows your member organizations to join on and just have the cost of each background check as opposed to having to do the startup fee. So that is a cost.
Yeah, that is correct. So again, I mentioned we utilize National Center for Safety Initiatives at Move United for our own background checks, as well as we've set up the parent-child account system similarly to USOPC's. And I was gonna try to echo your point about they're updating their site, and we're in the same process of transitioning during this kind of programmatic downtime. So for those organizations or member organizations who have previously had an NCSI account and may not know what we're talking about, you'll be hearing from them in the next couple of weeks to transition that account, possibly transition that account over if you'd like.
Great. And Ryan, someone has asked sort of along those lines if Move United has plans for providing additional support for some of those smaller chapters to assist with those costs.
Yeah, great question. So we are in the process of working on coming up with a training, I don't want to say scholarship or grant, but providing a furtherly discounted or free of cost trainings to chapter or member organizations. Obviously, the current situation has postponed that a little bit because we've all had some other financial concerns or obligations come up. So watch the space on that. They'll most likely be coming out in the next month or two.
Great. So a question that is coming in is if a volunteer has had a background check by their job, can we use that as a copy if it's only at a state level, or do you require national level checks? And Ryan, that's probably for you.
Yeah, great question. So there are certain requirements within the background checks. I don't have them in front of me, so I don't want to misspeak, but national background check is definitely the requirement along with several other national databases. I'm happy to follow up more specifically with that individual to provide them the list and criteria that NCSI is checking against. And along those same lines, NCSI is not the required vendor of choice, but the criteria that's being checked against needs to be the same that is being checked by NCSI. So again, I'm happy to provide that to that individual further.
Great. So as chapters start to implement their sport protection policy, are there any documentation and reporting processes that you would recommend following, and anything you would want to make sure that you're avoiding when you're documenting potential issues? I don't know, maybe Hannah or Maggie can start with that question.
Could you say it one more time? I'm sorry.
You're fine. Are there any documenting and reporting processes that you would recommend following as you're implementing your policy? So anything you want to make sure that you're keeping on file, anything that you want to make sure you're not tracking, you know, privacy-wise or anything like that? And if any of you have that answer, I'll let any of you pop in.
Well, I don't know that I can speak to what you shouldn't track. We've more looked at helping NGBs with what they should be tracking. And so I would say if for your organizations to have, Maggie mentioned, if you don't have a learning management system, that's okay. There's still an efficient way to do this using Excel or Google Docs or whatever you have at your disposal. And tracking first of all, having a process owner, so one person at your organization who's handling these reports coming in and is that designated person. And if this person is out of the office on vacation, that it's clear who the backup is, and having an internal protocol for that, number one. And then number two, tracking where these, which our policy, the map, but yours is for your policy, where these different reports are coming in. So whether it's the transportation, whether it's here, so that you can notice trends going forward. And then this can help in maybe building out education where your specific membership needs help. That would be my first suggestion. Also tracking date that it comes in, so you can be tracking how long it's taking you to get to certain claimants, making sure that a month hasn't gone by and you haven't communicated with the report that's come in is something that we've seen. And I think like I said, all of this can be done through an Excel document and having a comprehensive document where all of this is in one place.
Great. And following off of that, someone's asking, if a violation is reported, how do we protect the privacy of the person that's being reported on? Is that something that one of you can speak to?
Sure. So this is Katie. I can start, and then Maggie, I think you might jump in as well. You know, and so certainly if you all have a protocol in place in terms of who's investigating those reports at the organization, one, making sure that that individual has gone through training, you have protected information so that you're not sharing that with the entire organization. Obviously, you have a mandatory reporting obligation to law enforcement for any child abuse that's reported to you. But what we know about these reports coming in is it's so critical to protect the confidentiality of survivors who are disclosing to you and telling you about things that have happened. If you identify that there's a conflict of interest specifically for you, if you know that person that they're reporting to you about, I would recommend that you have a process in place to make sure who else at a different level, or potentially reaching out to Ryan with Move United, thinking about what that second tier is of who can investigate that. So do you have someone externally to address the conflict of interest that you may be in, somebody externally that can investigate those reports? But certainly what we do at our organization, so we have a response and resolution department. I know some of you on the phone may have, you know, jurisdictional affiliation with your high performance management organization members, or if you're affiliated with a national governing body. In those instances, you know, we have a separate group of investigators. They're trained to take in those reports. It's a 24/7 online system. People can report anonymously or include their identifiable information on there. And it's those separate investigative teams. They keep that information very confidential. So I would say that's really central to what you're doing, and making sure that you have a protocol in place in terms of who is getting those reports and what they're doing with that information. Maggie, anything else that you want to add? I mean, certainly I know that you're dealing with investigations all the time.
Sure. I completely echo everything that Katie said, as far as it's very important to have the primary point of contact, the secondary point of contact if available. Those matters should be kept confidential. We do look at need to know. So for instance, if an allegation of sexual misconduct came in, that you have enough information to decide that this individual should maybe not be participating at this time and should be on a temporary suspension while you're doing the investigation, you obviously have people that would have a need to know to be able to enforce those measures. If you were looking at perhaps an emotional misconduct where it's a line between, is this more of a rude behavior that's going to be handled at a managerial level, or does this rise to a violation of emotional misconduct? Those you can obviously keep a little closer and wouldn't need to tell individuals if you're not implementing a temporary measure or some sort of suspension that people would need to enforce. And as far as anonymous reports, we also accept anonymous reports, sometimes depending on the amount of information you have, or if there are any other witnesses or ability, through maybe social media posts or text messages to be able to investigate that without a party. You have to kind of make that determination on how much you're able to do. But all of these things are very important because sometimes this information will later establish a pattern of behavior. You may have something that doesn't result in a violation of emotional misconduct, and maybe you just have a conversation with that individual about, like, this is not conduct that we accept here, and you have a plan for them to work on it, and then later on you receive additional reports, and that can go towards patterns. So documentation of even these minor incidents that maybe are handled with an informal conversation is key in eventually preventing abuse down the line.
And I would also say, I'm not sure if Katie mentioned it, but in addition to the ability to report anonymously, is ensuring that there's an anti-retaliation policy so that people really feel comfortable coming forward.
Great. And a question, Ryan, for you. Someone's asking, will Move United establish a unified reporting template for member organizations, similar to how we do for, our insurance incidents and all of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Move United's created a handbook template for this policy as a whole that can be adopted and customized for your organization. And that includes a reporting form and a document that, again, you'll want to customize it to make it for your own organization. But it's again, extremely similar to the Safe Sports reporting form to capture the appropriate information and document everything that we're kind of discussing here. So that is available.
Great. We got about 12 minutes left. I want to shift a little bit away from in-person programming. As you know, we're moving to sort of a digital world. We're obviously hosting this event digitally. So Hannah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how organizations have enforced some of the abuse prevention policies that are effective outside of programming, such as social media and electronic communications. I know you talked a little bit about some of the apps that people are using, but is there anything else that people can start to think about as they're implementing sort of a social media plan?
Yeah, so in addition to what I mentioned about the larger platforms, Facebook and Twitter, and coming up with some protocols and some parameters there, I think that that's important because that's where we see a lot of slips. So even if you've implemented a team app and this is what you're using, if an adult participant, covered individual, applicable adult has access to a minor athlete in that way, that is still causing issues. So I think it's important to set parameters in your policies regarding that and what the expectations are as well, not just for the coaches and the adult participants to understand, but also for parents so that they can understand that it may not be appropriate for their child to be connected with this particular coach. So I think that the parent piece is very important to that as well. One thing I was going to mention, I think the first part of your question, not specific to social media, but just overall, how are organizations enforcing some of these policies, including social media? it's actually positive reinforcement, not negative reinforcement. So they're offering, you know, posting on their website, you know, this particular organization, you know, met all these requirements in a more positive light, as opposed to negative reinforcement, you know, removing them and posting them on their website in a negative way. And most, I'd say, I think 7 or 8 of the national governing bodies have utilized this and found it to be very helpful, almost a competition between the organizations at who can comply, and also holding each other accountable when you have public visibility like that, so that others can see.
Great. And someone had a question that I think is pretty common to our organization. You know, some people have sort of existing Facebook friendships with people that they're serving, and you know, whether it be adults or kids in the program. As you're implementing a program, are there any best practices for ensuring, you know, some of those existing relationships, either allowing them to continue or, you know, requiring that unfortunately you have to, you know, maybe defriend someone on Facebook?
Sure. So one of the things our preview with the release of the minor athlete abuse prevention policies that's coming out later this summer is we've been spending a lot of time talking about this very issue. So we know in youth sports, a lot of your volunteers, they have existing relationships that predate the sports relationship. And so we're actually going to be creating through a template consent form, identifying your relationship. So really making sure that, you know, parents and kids and youth and any of those coaches, they're disclosing, you know, this is my neighbor, you know, I'm a friend of the family, for a parent to identify if it's appropriate for their child who is now, you know, being coached by that adult that they've known for 10 years, if that's an acceptable form of that relationship, and so for the parent to be able to disclose that. So we will be releasing that this summer, and certainly that, you know, will be available to Move United and others to use that template dual relationships form to be able to identify that.
Great.
That's an awesome resource. Thanks for sharing that, Katie. But one thing I did want to point out is that in the standard for the Move United Sport Protection Policy, coaches are not, unless they are family, are not, or volunteers, I should say, covered individuals as a whole, are not to be connected with individuals on social media. And currently we don't have language in there around exceptions. But if there are certain, I see one in the chat right now that just says, I just unfriend them. I tell them I'm unfriending them. And obviously the dialogues with the parent as well to help them understand why. But, you know, we'll definitely keep an eye out for that later this summer and see if any tweaks need to be made to our policies.
Yeah.
Great.
And one thing just to add on that too, just as we're talking about everything being virtual right now, we actually put together some resources on keeping athletes safe during COVID-19. So there's a resource for parents, for athletes, and for coaches, because sometimes we think about, you know, if this practice session is happening with the confines of our home, that it shouldn't be a problem, but it still poses those safety risks. And so we want to remind parents, athletes, and coaches to still follow those prevention policies, because the intent is really about limiting one-on-one interactions between adults who have regular contact with their authority over kids. And so it's about making sure you have parental consent to have that practice session, that parents are aware that these things are happening. When athletes and kids are having a practice session with their team, it's not occurring in a bedroom or a private location, that there are other people that can come into the room, it's observable and interruptible. So we can certainly share that resource out because we think it's a really helpful reminder as things continue to be virtual for quite a while.
And Ryan, I think this is hopefully a quick question. Are we requiring that social media policy for adult athletes or minors only?
Currently it's designed for minors only, but if your organization wants to extend it out to all participants or all adult participants who may not be their own legal guardians, it's your decision to make as your own organization. But currently the standard is for minor athletes.
Great. So we've probably got enough time for one, maybe two more questions. And someone asked a great question. Is there a standard length of time from incident to reporting? And further, if you know an incident occurred before the organization was using Safe Sport, but they now are, how would you sort of manage that very tricky situation? And I'm going to open that up to maybe Katie or Hannah.
Yeah, I can certainly, go ahead, Hannah.
Well, I was just going to say to the second piece, our organization sees that all the time, as our organization only existed in 2017, and a lot of the national governing bodies didn't have policies in existence much before that. So I would still say, despite whatever time frame, to still bring that forward to that in that template that I spoke about earlier, where you're tracking all of this, to still bring that forward. It may be more difficult to speak to witnesses and to get some of that information, but it shouldn't be precluded just because it's not current, as of today or whenever your policy was in effect. So that shouldn't preclude these reports coming forward. And there is a way to handle and respond to these, even if there wasn't a policy set in place during the time of the alleged misconduct.
Yeah,
Sure.
and there's a lot of, go ahead, Maggie.
Oh, go ahead.
There's a lot of reasons why people who have experienced abuse and violence don't report right away, whether that happened yesterday or whether it happened 40 years ago. And as Hannah shared, we have seen, an increase in reports of people when it happened just recently and it happened a long time ago, because we're seeing that the culture is changing. I think the commitment that you all have around this issue to preventing abuse in sport and making sure that people have a safe environment to practice and compete has really shifted people's comfort level and feeling like, okay, this is the time where I can report, or having a confidential place where they can go. And so whenever someone decides that it's the time that they feel comfortable to disclose, it's really important that, we listen, we make sure that they have the resources. We're reporting to law enforcement around our mandatory reporting obligation and connecting the dots, because even if they say to you that it happened at another organization, if you all have questions about, how the U.S. Center for Safe Sport can help, if they happen to be part of the movement, we're certainly available to assist with that, so that we're connecting the dots, because we've received more than 4,000 reports since we opened 3 years ago. And so we do have identified patterns of behavior with particular individuals. And so, certainly that's something that our investigative team, if we receive a report online, they will certainly look into that. And just as you're getting more training out there and increasing awareness, you should anticipate that more people will come forward and report. It doesn't mean that it's happening in a greater rate, but it means that people feel like, thank you for, taking this issue seriously, and now is the time that we can address that.
Great. And then I think we have time for just this one last question. And I believe the answer to this is that it kind of varies by state and municipality, but someone is asking, they're saying they've found differing opinions on who is a mandatory reporter. How do they identify who is a mandatory reporter, or is it assumed that everyone who's taken a safe sport or darkness to light training is mandatory reporter?
So I'll hop in here, because I know it comes kind of from individuals who are outside of the USOPC movement and safe sport oversight. Now with the sport protection policy, anyone who is seen as a participant or a covered individual of that organization is now considered a mandatory reporter within their organization. So if they are made aware of any form of abuse against a minor, it is their responsibility to report. And that is covered, it's not just because they've taken the training, it's because their organization now has a policy in place around it. But how to do that is also covered in those respective trainings.
Great. Well, everyone, we have 1 minute left, so I think unfortunately that doesn't allow us a lot of time to answer another question. So I think we're going to cut it off here. I really appreciate everyone joining us for this great discussion, and for all of the panelists for being on here. Please continue to reach out to Ryan and share your best practices amongst the group that was in attendance today. You will see a survey link that just popped up in the chat. It will also appear on your screen when you exit. Please fill that out. It does allow us to continue to provide high quality educational programming to our member network. Let attendees, you can also stay involved in the conversation and share your thoughts throughout the conference on social media using the hashtag MoveUnited. Thanks again, everyone.